My name is Evelyn Rourke. I'm 66. The clock in my daughter's dining room had just struck 6 when she called from the kitchen. Dinner's ready. Her voice carried the bright, polished tone she used for company. Though it was only family tonight, her husband, their teenage son, and me. Still, the way she said it made me straighten my back, as if I were an extra in a play I hadn't rehearsed for. The table gleamed with soft candlelight, the kind that flatters everyone. I had given her that table when she moved into this house oak with carved legs, a wedding gift from my late husband's parents. Back then, she'd thanked me with tears. Now, she barely glanced up as I entered the room, only muttering, "Sit wherever, Mom." I set the bowl of collard greens I'd brought beside her roasted chicken. The smell filled the room, salt, lemon, butter, and something faintly burnt. Her husband, Nathan, was already seated, scrolling through his phone with one hand and sipping wine with the other. Across from him, my grandson, Dylan, drummed his fingers against the placemat, earbuds still dangling from his neck. "Smells great," I said. Marissa smiled, brief and professional. "I tried a new recipe. Don't worry, it's not too spicy for you." Her tone was light, but something in it landed wrong. Too careful, too knowing. The air in that room always carried invisible rules what to say, what not to remember. We bowed our heads when Nathan offered a quick grace. "Thank you for the food." And family, he mumbled. Forks lifted almost before the amen ended. I watched my daughter across the table, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, perfectly styled, perfectly in control. The gold watch on her wrist caught the candlelight, the same one I'd bought her years ago when she landed her first job. She'd worn it ever since, though now it looked more like part of the costume than a memory. Conversation drifted like smoke. Nathan talked about a client buying property downtown. Dylan mentioned soccer practice. I nodded when expected, laughed when it felt polite. I'd been doing that for years, smiling at the edges of their lives, trying not to take up too much space. Halfway through dinner, Marissa poured more wine into her glass and leaned back. "So," she began, swirling the liquid slowly. "Mom, what did you do today?" Her question was casual, but her eyes held that faint sparkle I'd learned to recognize the prelude to something sharp. "Oh, nothing exciting," I said. "I walked down to the market, read for a while, tried a new soup recipe." "Soup?" she repeated, her smile widening. "Of course." Nathan chuckled under his breath. Dylan looked down at his plate. I felt the prickle behind my ribs before the words even came. "It must be nice," she said, "having so much free time. I can't imagine what it's like to not have to be useful anymore." For a second, the sounds around me dulled the clinking of cutlery, the soft hum of the ceiling fan. I stared at my plate. The half-eaten chicken, the neat triangle of cornbread. She hadn't looked away. "Marissa," Nathan murmured, half warning, half weary. What she said lightly, "I didn't mean anything bad. I just admire how relaxed she is. I'd lose my mind without a job." I looked at her, really looked. The white blouse, the perfect manicure, the faint smudge of foundation near her temple. Everything about her was curated, down to her laughter. I remembered when she used to call me 3 times a week, crying over bills or clients. Her voice, small and uncertain. That was before the boutique, before success made her voice sound like this. I took a sip of water, steadying my hand. "It's not so bad," I said, being relaxed. "I mean," she smiled again, that polished grin. "Sure, must be hard being useless." Though, the words hung in the air like broken glass. Dylan's fork froze. Nathan set down his wine. For a long moment, I didn't speak. I just looked at her. My daughter, the child I'd raised through scraped knees and night terrors, now staring at me like I was something fragile and ridiculous. When I finally found my voice, it was quiet. "Excuse me." She blinked, realizing too late that the joke had gone too far. "Mom, I was kidding," she said quickly. "You take everything so seriously." But she wasn't kidding. I could see it in her eyes, the small, satisfied glint of someone who needed to remind herself who held the power now. I folded my napkin slowly, my pulse steady but rising in my throat. The clock ticked above the mantel. Somewhere outside, a car passed, its headlights sweeping across the windows. I looked at her one last time and smiled, though my voice came out softer than I expected. "Then I suppose," I said, "it must be hard knowing I own your house." The room went still. Marissa's smile faltered. Nathan looked at me, then at her, unsure whether to speak. Dylan stared at his plate. No one said another word. I pushed back my chair, the sound scraping against the hardwood, and stood. "Thank you for dinner," I said, and picked up my purse from the counter. The candles flickered as I opened the front door. Warm Charleston air swept in, carrying the smell of salt and gardenias. I stepped out, closing the door softly behind me. The sound of my daughter's laughter lingered faintly in the house behind me, bright, brittle, and already fading. The next morning, Charleston was still heavy with summer heat. Even though it was barely 9, I stood by the kitchen window of my cottage, watching the sunlight cut through the moss-draped oaks. The air so thick it seemed to hum, the events from last night replayed in my mind. Sharp and echoing Marissa's voice, the tilt of her chin, the way the room had gone silent. I poured myself a cup of coffee, black and bitter, and tried to shake it off. For years, I'd trained myself to absorb her comments, to file them away in that quiet place where mothers store every unkind word they pretend not to hear. But this one wouldn't settle. By mid-morning, my neighbor, Helen Porter, knocked on the door. She was 70, quick-witted, and the only person who ever dared to call me out when I smiled through pain. "You left early last night," she said, setting down a small basket of peaches. "Don't tell me the chicken was that bad." "It wasn't the chicken," I said, forcing a small laugh. Helen studied me with that steady gaze that saw too much. "Marissa again," I nodded. "She said something unkind." Helen sighed softly. "She always did have her father's tongue." I smiled faintly at that. My late husband, Paul, had been brilliant and cutting, charming in public but relentless at home. Marissa had inherited his wit, but not his restraint. Still, I couldn't bring myself to speak ill of her. "She's just stressed." I said, "The business, the house, Dylan's tuition, it's a lot." Helen tilted her head. "You can't excuse cruelty forever. Evelyn," her words lingered long after she left. That evening, as dusk spread over the marshes, my phone buzzed a message from Marissa. "We need to talk. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. At the studio, no apology, no explanation. Just command." I didn't reply. The next morning, I drove downtown to her boutique, Rourke and Hayes Interiors, tucked into a renovated brick building near Broad Street. Through the window, I could see her talking to a client, her posture immaculate, her voice smooth. The space looked like a magazine-spread white walls, gold fixtures, vases of eucalyptus. I remembered when it had been an empty shell. I'd helped her paint those walls, brought sandwiches when she worked late. The scent of that fresh paint still lived somewhere in my memory, right beside the pride I used to feel. When the client left, she gestured for me to sit. "I didn't mean to upset you," she began, her voice measured. "You know I joke too much. It wasn't a joke," I said quietly. She sighed, brushing invisible dust from her desk. "You take everything personally." "Mom, I was just teasing. Everyone knows you're comfortable. You have your savings. your pension. You've earned your rest. I didn't build my life just to rest, I said. She smiled, but there was steel beneath it. Then what are you doing with it? You could travel, volunteer something. You've got all this money sitting in accounts while people like me are out here building things. The word building stung. She said it like I'd never built anything, like decades of work, of mortgages paid and children fed. Weren't creation enough? I folded my hands in my lap. Marissa, I built the foundation that lets you do what you're doing. I helped you start this business. She leaned back, crossing her legs. You invested. Mom, don't make it sound like charity. You chose to help. No one asked you to. Her voice was cool, rehearsed, like a woman reading a statement in court. I did ask, I said softly. You called me the night the bank turned you down. You were crying. Her eyes flickered just for a second, then hardened. That was years ago. Things are different now. I looked around the studio again. The flowers, the soft jazz, the expensive chandelier that hadn't been there last year. My name was nowhere on the door, though my money had paid for the sign. You're right, I said at last. Things are different. She relaxed slightly, mistaking my calm for surrender. Good. Then let's not drag up the past. She stood, signaling the end of the conversation. I have a shipment coming in. Can we just move on from last night? I rose slowly. We already have, I said, outside. The air was heavy with humidity and the distant hum of cicadas. I walked down the brick sidewalk, past the boutiques and cafes, and paused at a corner where a young couple admired a storefront window. The glass caught my reflection-tired eyes. Silver hair pinned neatly back. A woman who'd spent her life making things easier for others. For the first time in years, I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to. That night, rain swept through Charleston, thin silver streaks against the streetlights, tapping softly on the windows of my cottage. I sat at the kitchen table with the light off, the sound of water filling the silence. I hadn't planned to say those words. They had simply risen, steady and sharp, from some deep place that had grown tired of swallowing hurt. Must be hard knowing I own your house. I'd never seen Marissa look like that before, her expression stripped of control, of certainty. I hadn't shouted, hadn't raised my voice. The calmness had been its own kind of thunder. By morning, my phone was full of unread messages, one from Nathan. Polite, but strained. She didn't mean it that way. Maybe we can all talk. Another from Marissa. I think we both said things we regret, but I didn't regret it. Not yet. I spent the day moving quietly through the house. Every object had a story tied to her photographs from birthdays. The crystal vase I'd once wrapped in newspaper when she and Nathan bought their first home. A checkbook register filled with years of transfers I could recite by heart. When I reached the back shelf of my filing cabinet, I found the folder I'd kept hidden for years. Inside were copies of wire transfers, tax receipts, the final mortgage documents, her name and mine printed side by side. She'd called it a temporary arrangement, just until we stabilize. She'd said, "You'll still be part of it." Of course, that had been 8 years ago. I remembered signing the papers in her living room while Dylan built Lego towers on the floor. She'd thanked me with tears in her eyes, promising to take care of the house like it was sacred. For a while, she did. Then the boutique came, and the renovations, and the parties. The payments stopped. I picked them up quietly, telling myself it was what mothers did. I ran my fingers over the papers now, the raised notary seal catching faint light. Proof not of ownership, but of everything I had given without acknowledgement. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the harbor. I closed the folder and slid it back into the drawer, my hand steady, for once. The silence in my house didn't feel empty. It felt earned. The wipers beat a steady rhythm against the windshield, as I turned onto the narrow road that curved along the marsh. Charleston's lights shimmered behind me, soft and distant through the rain. The house I had just left felt even farther away. For most of my adult life, driving home after one of Marissa's dinners had always been the same ritual: turn up the radio, keep my hands steady, and pretend that everything was fine. But tonight, my fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, my chest too full for any song to fit inside it. The headlights caught the wet gleam of the asphalt, the Spanish moss hanging low like gray silk ribbons. I could almost hear Paul's voice beside me, deep and certain as it had been in our younger days. He used to say, "Don't let guilt run the house." Evie, it never pays rent, I had laughed back then, not realizing that guilt would someday become the tenant I couldn't evict. When Paul died, Marissa was 29, just old enough to think she didn't need advice, just young enough to still ask for help. She'd cried on the phone that night, saying she didn't know how to keep the lights on in her apartment, how to handle bills, taxes, insurance. I had gone to her apartment with a folder of forms and a checkbook. That night became a pattern I never broke. Each time she stumbled, I caught her. Tuition for Dylan's preschool, the first down payment on the house, the new business loan when the bank hesitated. I told myself it was love, that helping her meant keeping our family whole. I didn't notice when it stopped being generosity and became expectation. Somewhere along the way, gratitude had been replaced by silence. The rain softened into mist as I crossed the bridge. Below, the water rippled in slow silver lines. I remembered the first time I'd brought Marissa there as a little girl, her hand in mine, her voice full of wonder. "Look, Mama," she'd said, "the river's shining." Back then, she had believed everything I touched could keep her safe. Now she believed it made her weak. When I reached my cottage, Bastasa, the porch light was still on, casting a warm circle against the wet ground. I sat for a long time in the parked car, listening to the soft tick of cooling metal. Then I switched off the engine, stepped into the rain, and let the quiet close around me like something final. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, quiet Charleston. My cottage smelled faintly of damp earth and coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, still in my robe, listening to the creak of the ceiling fan and the soft drip of rainwater from the eaves. I hadn't slept much. My mind had looped through years of moments I'd worked so hard to forget Marissa's calls for help, her tears over another bounced check, her voice trembling when she said, "Just until the next month. Mom, always until, always next." The truth of what I'd done for her lived in one place. A single drawer in my home office, bottom right, just above the floor. I'd opened it 1,000 times to file bills and receipts. But that morning, I pulled it out fully, like someone lifting a stone from a riverbed to see what had been living underneath. Inside were folders arranged with the precision I'd carried from my years as a financial planner, labeled tabs in careful penmanship: tuition, mortgage, boutique, medical, teas, each folder thick with paper, the corners soft from years of being handled. The first file I opened was mortgage. The earliest document dated back 12 years. When the house had first gone into her name, I traced the ink of my signature beside hers. Remembering how proud she'd looked when the realtor handed her the keys, she'd hugged me so tightly then, whispering, "I'll never forget this." But she had. I flipped through pages: monthly transfers, notes scrawled in my handwriting. June late again, paid directly. October bank threatened foreclosure, settled in full. Each line was a story of panic averted, shame hidden, stability quietly restored, then tuition, Dylan's preschool, then private elementary, then high school, the schools she swore were worth it for the network. I had wired over $40,000 in 5 years. The last note in that folder read simply, Final year, no acknowledgement. Next was boutique. The thickest folder, inside. I found invoices from contractors, shipping receipts, payment confirmations. One transfer was circled in red, $60,000. The day I'd bailed her out when the landlord threatened to lock her out. I remembered the call, her voice breaking between rehearsed confidence and quiet despair. Mom, if I lose this space, everything falls apart. I had told her I'd help, but this time, I'd drawn up a contract. Not out of mistrust, but out of instinct. I was 60 then, already thinking of retirement. My lawyer friend, Harriet, had helped me write it. A simple clause: any loan exceeding $50,000 would secure partial ownership until repayment. Marissa had signed it quickly, barely glancing at the pages. That document lay at the top of the folder now. The notary's seal still clear, my name printed alongside hers, 51% ownership. I ran a finger over it. She had probably forgotten it existed. The room was so still, I could hear the pulse in my own ears. I reached for the medical folder next, smaller, only a few slips. Bills from when Dylan broke his wrist, when Marissa needed emergency dental surgery and her insurance had lapsed. I'd paid them all. She'd texted afterward, "You're a lifesaver, Mom," with a heart emoji. That had been the last time she'd said thank you. As I stacked the papers neatly, something inside me began to shift. Not anger, not pride, but a kind of sad astonishment. It wasn't that I'd given too much. It was that I'd done it quietly, believing that silence was the price of love. I walked to the window, holding one of the transfer receipts up to the light. Outside, the sun had returned, glinting off the wet leaves. The reflection of my hand trembled faintly on the glass, thin and lined, but steady. I thought of all the ways I had tried to protect her financially, emotionally, socially, and how each act of rescue had chipped away at the boundary between generosity and erasure. I had kept records because it was my habit. But now, they felt like proof of something I hadn't meant to document: how a mother's devotion can become invisible currency. I placed every folder back in order, closed the drawer, and pressed my palm against it. The wood was cool beneath my skin, solid and final. Somewhere in that stack of paper was the map of my silence and the quiet evidence of everything I had been too afraid to claim as mine. I stood there for a long time, the morning light spilling across the floor, feeling for the first time not the weight of what I'd given, but the space left where love used to live. The papers stayed on my desk for the rest of the afternoon, edges aligned, quiet as witnesses. I moved around them like someone walking through a room filled with ghosts, careful not to disturb the dead. Every page told the story of my life without ever mentioning my name. Somewhere among those records was the thing I'd given up most easily of all my own dream. I had once planned to buy a small cabin at Lake Kiowee, 3 hours northwest of Charleston. It wasn't anything grand: one bedroom, a screened porch, and a little dock that reached out over the still water. I'd found it by accident on a Sunday drive years ago when I'd needed to get out of the city after Paul's funeral. The place was tucked between 2 pine-covered slopes, with a rusted mailbox and a "for sale by owner" sign leaning slightly in the grass. I'd stopped the car and just stared at it, the way you stare at something you didn't know your heart had been waiting for. The owner had been an older man named Carl, widowed like me. He'd walked me through the property that afternoon, pointing out where his wife used to plant azaleas. The house smelled faintly of cedar and lake air. It felt like breathing after years of holding my breath. I started saving that same month. Every bonus, every refund, every unspent dollar from my small consulting jobs went into what I called the lake account. I didn't tell anyone, not even Marissa. It wasn't a secret. Exactly, it was just something fragile. Something that needed silence to grow. I imagined that cabin endlessly morning coffee on the porch, A small easel by the window, the lake catching the early sun. I would drive up on weekends, maybe invite Helen once in a while. For the first time in my life, the future felt like mine alone. Then, Marissa called. I still remember the exact moment, the sharp ring cutting through a quiet evening, the smell of rain through an open window. She was crying. The boutique's landlord had doubled the rent, a supplier had backed out, and the bank had declined her loan. She said the words that always undid me, Mom. I don't know what to do. By the time we hung up, I had already decided. I drove to her townhouse the next morning. She looked small sitting at the kitchen counter, her hair pulled back, eyes swollen from lack of sleep. If I can't fix this, she whispered, I'll lose everything. She didn't ask me directly for money. She didn't have to. I knew that tone, the one that carried both pride and desperation. I told her I had some savings, that I could transfer what she needed to cover her debt and secure the lease for another year. She hugged me so tightly, I could feel her heartbeat racing against mine. I'll pay you back. I promise, she said. 2 days later, I withdrew $38,000 from the lake account. I remember sitting in the bank parking lot afterward, staring at the withdrawal slip. The air conditioner hummed softly, carrying the faint smell of paper and printer ink. I felt both light and hollow, like someone who had just traded something invisible. Weeks turned into months. The boutique reopened with new decor and glossy photos on social media. Marissa's smile returned. She posted pictures of our wonderful new space, tagging her husband, but not me. I told myself it didn't matter, that seeing her succeed was enough. Every now and then, I'd drive up toward Lake Kiowee, taking the exit that led to the road where the cabin once stood. It sold that same year. Carl left me a voicemail, kind but brief. Didn't want you to think I went behind your back. Got an offer I couldn't refuse. I deleted it immediately, but never really erased the sound of his voice. The cabin became something I carried like an ache, a small, beautiful thing that could have been mine, replaced by something that never truly was. A few years later, when my consulting contracts slowed down, I tried not to think about how much that decision had cost. The cabin would have been my place to exhale, to live quietly, without needing to earn or fix or prove. Instead, I watched my daughter's business grow, watched her drive a new car, post about building dreams. Sometimes, when she called, her voice bright with excitement about another expansion or partnership, I'd picture the lake. The water was probably low that year, the dock worn, the pine trees bending in the wind. I imagined someone else living there, a stranger making coffee in a kitchen that could have been mine. I told myself I'd made the right choice, that helping her build a future was better than claiming a quiet one for myself. But even now, years later, I can still see that cabin clearly, white shutters, chipped steps, sunlight drifting across the porch. It's strange how the things we lose quietly never really leave us. They just wait in the corners of our memory, untouched, reminding us of what we once believed we didn't deserve. It was late March when the phone rang, a weekday morning washed in the kind of pale Charleston light that makes everything look honest. I had been pruning the rosemary outside when I saw Marissa's name flash across the screen. I hesitated before answering, wiping my hands on my jeans. Her voice came bright, too rehearsed. Hi, Mom. How are you? You sound busy. I'm fine, I said. Just in the garden. That's nice, she replied quickly. Before her tone shifted into something smoother, practiced. Listen, I wanted to talk to you about something exciting. Those words always carried a price. She told me the boutique was thriving, that she and her partner wanted to expand into the vacant space next door. We've been offered the lease, but we need to move fast, she said. This could double our visibility, foot traffic, new clients, everything. I listened in silence, letting her rhythm fill the space. I knew the cadence by heart, the excitement first. Then the subtle drift into obligation. She continued, "The bank's on board, but they're asking for a cosigner. Just a formality. Really. They know I have investors, but they want a stronger profile on the application. It's not like they'd ever need to contact you." My stomach tightened. "How much?" "A small bridge loan," she said, the words slipping out like something delicate. 65,000. We'd pay it off in less than a year. I promise. There it was, the familiar script. The request framed as opportunity, the tone sweetened just enough to sound like family. I walked back inside. The phone pressed against my ear, the air conditioning humming faintly. "You're sure this is necessary?" I asked. "It's a business decision, Mom," she said, almost impatiently. "You used to understand things like this. You know how leverage works." Her voice had that old edge again, half compliment, half accusation. She knew exactly how to press the right buttons. "I do understand," I said quietly. "Then you know how important timing is. If we wait, someone else will take that space. This is what separates successful people from the ones who just sit back." The silence between us was long and careful, outside. The hum of cicadas had started early, filling the gaps she left in her sentences. "Marissa," I said finally, "you have other investors. Why not ask them?" She laughed softly. "Because they don't have your credit history or your reputation. You're the safest option." "Come on, Mom, you've always been the responsible one." Responsible. The word landed heavier than she knew. I sat at the kitchen table, tracing the grain of the wood with my thumb. For a brief second, I pictured the lake cabin again, the one that had slipped through my fingers for her sake. I wondered what it might have felt like to be free from these conversations, from this endless exchange of promises. "Mom," she prompted. I cleared my throat. "Let me think about it." "Of course," she said quickly. "But please don't take too long. The lease could be gone by Friday. And Mom, thank you. Seriously. I knew you'd get it." When the call ended, I left the phone on the table and stared out the window. The rosemary swayed in the afternoon breeze, its scent rising through the screen door. For the first time in years, I didn't feel guilt or pride, just a slow, quiet exhaustion. The sun dipped lower, and I realized the shadows in the room had begun to shift. I sat still and let them lengthen, spreading across the papers I had left on the desk, the ones that reminded me exactly how much help had already cost. That night, I sat at my desk long after the sun had gone down, the lamplight pooling over the folders I hadn't yet put away. Outside, the crickets were loud, steady, as if trying to fill the silence between my thoughts. I picked up the phone twice before I finally called her back. My hands didn't shake this time. Marissa answered on the second ring. "Hey, Mom, I was starting to think you'd forgotten." Her voice was bright, expectant. I didn't forget. I said, "I thought about what you asked." "Good," she said quickly. "You'll see it's a smart move. I'll draw up the papers tomorrow. You can come by the boutique. We'll sign everything together. The bank will love seeing your name on it." She was already celebrating, the kind of excitement that assumed compliance. I could hear the sound of her heels clicking on the boutique floor, the hum of success she liked to broadcast even through the phone. "Marissa," I said, keeping my voice calm, "I'm not going to co-sign the loan." For a moment, she didn't speak. I could almost hear her blink. Then came a small laugh, quick, uncertain. "What do you mean, I mean no?" I said. "I can't do it." She laughed again, louder this time, though it sounded more like disbelief. "Mom, don't be dramatic. It's just paperwork. You won't actually be paying anything." "I understand," I replied. "But I'm not signing." Her tone sharpened. "Why is this about that stupid dinner? You're still upset about a joke. This isn't about dinner. Then what you've helped before. You know this business supports Dylan, the mortgage, everything. You've been part of it since the beginning." That's the problem. I said, she exhaled sharply, you're being unfair. After everything you've invested, do you really want to throw it all away? Now I'm not throwing anything away, I said softly. I'm just done adding to it. The pause that followed stretched so long I thought she might hang up. When she spoke again, her voice was brittle, the brightness gone. Wow. I guess retirement really does change people. I suppose it does. I said. She muttered something under her breath. Something that sounded like selfish. And then the line went dead. I set the phone down gently, listening to the faint click of disconnection fade into quiet. For the first time in years, there was no immediate guilt. No rush to call back and smooth things over, just stillness. I looked at the stack of folders on the desk, proof of years I couldn't reclaim, and for once, I didn't feel small beside them. I turned off the lamp, the room folding into darkness, and sat there until my eyes adjusted. The quiet didn't scare me anymore. It felt like the beginning of something I had forgotten could exist my own voice. The next morning, the air was sharp and cool, the kind of Charleston morning that carried both salt and silence. I brewed coffee, poured it into my favorite chipped mug, and stood by the window watching a heron glide low over the marsh. My hands felt steady. It was strange. That calm, like I'd stepped outside a storm I didn't know I'd been living in. I sat down at my desk and pulled open the drawer again. The folders waited, patient and precise. My fingers found the one marked Mortgage, 2016. I hadn't looked at it in years. Inside was the document that had quietly rewritten the ownership of Marissa's home. I remembered that spring in detail. The boutique had been struggling then, 2 new leases, rising costs. Another round of apologies that never sounded quite sincere. She'd called one evening in tears, saying, "The bank won't extend the line of credit, and if we lose the store, we'll lose the house. Dylan's finally in a good school. Please." Mom, I'd told her to come over. She arrived with red eyes, wearing one of the blouses I'd bought her the Christmas before. Nathan had stayed in the car. We sat at my kitchen table, the one Paul and I had bought secondhand when we were newly married. It was where we'd planned every decision that mattered. "I just need you to co-sign the refinance," she said. Just this once. But I had learned my lesson from the first loan that vanished into her boutique's walls. So I called my lawyer friend, Harriet Leland, a retired litigator I'd worked with for years. Harriet came over the next morning, bringing a yellow folder and her unflinching sense of fairness. "You need protection," she said simply. "If you're paying the debt, you should hold the deed until she repays you." I had hesitated then. "She's my daughter." Harriet had smiled faintly, not unkindly. "Then you're lending her more than money, but that's still a loan." So we drafted the document clean, lawful, notarized. It stated that any financial contribution exceeding $50,000 toward the house would grant me temporary majority ownership, reverting to equal ownership upon full repayment. Marissa had signed it in Harriet's presence. Her signature a quick, careless flourish. She hadn't even read it all. She had hugged me afterward, crying again. "I don't know what I'd do without you." I'd believed her. The payments never came. After the first 6 months, she stopped mentioning them altogether. The house was renovated, painted white with blue shutters. She started calling it our forever home. I didn't remind her of the papers. Some part of me wanted to believe that silence was kindness. Now, as I held that same document nearly a decade later, the embossed notary seal still intact, I understood how silence had turned into surrender. I laid the pages flat across my desk. My name, Evelyn M. Rourke, appeared first under primary owner. Marissa's name followed, a smaller font, the pen stroke lighter. I traced the curve of her signature and remembered the way she'd once signed her first report card in crayon. insisting she was grown up. A soft knock startled me. Helen stood in the doorway, her raincoat damp from the drizzle. "I brought muffins," she said, holding a small paper bag. Her eyes darted to the papers on my desk. "You look like you're handling something big." "I'm just looking at the past," I said. Helen set the bag down and walked closer. "Sometimes the past is the only proof we have of what we endured." I nodded. "It's also proof of what I allowed." She didn't press. She never did. She just squeezed my shoulder before leaving. After she was gone, I gathered the papers and slipped them into a clean envelope. For years, I'd let those documents sleep in the dark, believing peace required silence. But as I sealed the envelope, I realized something else. Truth doesn't destroy peace, it reveals who actually built it. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, each second unhurried and certain. The house felt still, yet alive with something that had been missing for years: ownership. Not just of property, but of self. I placed the envelope in the center of the desk, smoothed the flap, and whispered into the quiet. Not anymore. It was nearly 11 when the knock came. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the porch. But then came another sharp, deliberate. I opened the curtains slightly. Marissa's car was in the driveway, headlights off, rain beating on the hood. Nathan stood beside her, his shoulders tense, his coat unbuttoned despite the chill. I hesitated before opening the door. The night smelled of wet earth and sea air, the kind that made Charleston feel older than it was. Marissa didn't wait for me to speak. She brushed past, her heels clicking on the wood floor. Nathan followed quietly, his expression already apologetic. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she said, spinning toward me. Her voice was tight, brittle. "I haven't done anything," I said. "You told the bank you wouldn't co-sign. Do you realize what that means? The lease is gone. They moved on to another buyer this afternoon." I closed the door gently, the latch catching with a soft click. "You said it was time sensitive." Her laugh was sharp, without humor. "You think this is funny? I lost a deal because you wanted to prove a point." Nathan stepped forward, his tone lower. "Careful, Marissa. Maybe we should—" "No," she snapped. "She needs to hear it." She turned back to me. "You've always had this way of pretending you're helpless. You like people to feel sorry for you, don't you?" The quiet little martyr. I didn't answer. The words landed, but they didn't pierce anymore. "You think saying no makes you powerful?" She continued. "It just makes you selfish. Dylan's tuition. Our business, you've always said family comes first." "I have," I said softly, "and for years, it did. But that doesn't mean I have to lose myself in the process." She stared at me, incredulous, as if I'd spoken in another language. "You sound ridiculous." Nathan cleared his throat, his eyes meeting mine briefly. "Mom, she's under a lot of pressure. The store's behind on payments, and the loan was supposed to cover." "I know what it was supposed to cover," I said. Marissa stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You wouldn't even have this house without Dad. Everything you owned started with him. And he'd be ashamed to see you turning your back on your own child." I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, just the quiet end of patience. "Your father taught me to keep what we worked for." I said, "That's what I'm doing." She blinked, caught off guard. For the first time, she seemed unsure. Nathan rubbed his temples. "Marissa, maybe we should go." But she didn't move. "I can't believe you'd rather watch us fail than help." "I'm not watching you fail," I said. "I'm giving you the chance to stand on your own." Her face hardened. "You'll regret this." I looked at her, the daughter I'd once carried through thunderstorms. The child who used to reach for my hand when the world felt too big. "Maybe," I said quietly, "but not tonight." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the steady patter of rain against the windows. Then Nathan touched her arm gently. She pulled away, but followed him toward the door. When it closed behind them, the house fell still again. I stood there, barefoot on the cold floor, listening to the rain fade into a distant whisper. The calm that settled over me wasn't victory. It was something heavier, quieter, like the closing of a long, unfinished chapter. I locked the door, turned off the porch light, and let the dark stay where it belonged. 3 days passed in silence. No calls, no messages. Even Helen noticed, stopping by with coffee one morning and saying, "Peace and quiet looks good on you, Evelyn." I smiled. Though the quiet didn't feel peaceful, it felt suspended, like air waiting for thunder. On the 4th morning, I found the letter. It sat in the mailbox between a utility bill and a grocery flyer. Thick and official looking, the envelope stamped with the blue seal of Charleston Federal. My name appeared on the front in crisp black ink, Evelyn M. Rourke. And beneath it, the address of the house that wasn't really mine, but legally still was. Inside, the letter was polite but unmistakably cold. Notice of delinquency. 3 missed mortgage payments. Penalties accruing. Risk of foreclosure. The final line stated, "As the primary deed holder, you are legally responsible for repayment or forfeiture." For a long time, I just stared at it. My first instinct was the same as it had always been to reach for the phone, to fix it before anyone found out. My hand even brushed the receiver before I stopped myself. I walked to the kitchen window. Outside, the marsh shimmered under the mid-morning light. The heron was there again, patient and still, waiting for movement beneath the surface. The steadiness of it calmed me. The house Marissa called hers was under my name. The taxes, the insurance, the foundation of every dollar that had kept it standing, all of it led back to me. She had forgotten, or chosen to forget, what that meant. But the bank hadn't. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it on my desk beside the sealed folder that held the contract. Both carried the same truth, one written in legal ink, the other in my own silence. When the phone finally rang that evening, I let it ring until the machine picked up. Her voice filled the room. Soft at first, then brittle. "Mom, we need to talk. It's urgent." I didn't delete the message. I didn't answer either. I sat at the table as dusk deepened, the unopened envelope still within reach. For the first time, the weight of what was mine and what wasn't felt perfectly clear. By the next morning, the weight of the letter had settled into me like a stone. I made coffee but didn't drink it. Paced between the kitchen and the front porch until I finally admitted what I already knew I needed to talk to Harriet. I hadn't seen her in nearly 2 years, not since her retirement celebration. She'd left corporate law behind for a quieter life in Mount Pleasant, though quiet was never a word that truly suited her. Harriet had always been made of steady, steel-sharp mind, direct speech, and the rare ability to make truth sound like comfort. When I called, she answered on the second ring. "Evelyn Rourke," she said, her voice rich with that familiar authority. "You sound like someone who's been sitting on something heavy." I exhaled. "You could say that. I might need your brain again off the record. Bring whatever's making you lose sleep," she said, "and come before noon." I still believe hard conversations deserve good coffee. By 11, I was in her kitchen, a wide, sunlit room lined with plants and books instead of case files. She poured 2 cups of dark roast and gestured toward the table. "All right," she said. "Show me what the storm looks like this time." I handed her the envelope from the bank and the copy of the 2016 contract. She read in silence, her brow furrowing slightly, the steam from her cup curling between us. When she finished, she tapped a manicured finger against the page. "You're still the legal majority owner," she said. "She hasn't refinanced, hasn't bought you out. Every payment that's missed lands on your record. You're not just a bystander, you're liable. I nodded. I know, but if I step in again, I undo everything I just said to her. And if I don't, she'll lose the house. Harriet finished. The words hung there, solid and true. I don't want to ruin her, I said quietly. I just don't want to be erased anymore. Harriet leaned back, studying me. You've spent years cushioning her from consequences. That's not love. Evelyn, that's insurance. And you've been paying the premiums alone. I tried to smile, but it felt fragile. You make it sound so simple. It isn't, she said gently, but it's clear. You have two options: protect your credit or protect her illusion. One's painful, the other's permanent. She flipped to the final page of the contract, where both our signatures, hers as witness, sat in neat black ink. You gave her a chance most people would never get. That contract was mercy dressed as structure. If she ignored it, that's her choice. I traced my name at the bottom of the page. The bank says I'm responsible for the debt, and legally, you are, Harriet said. But responsibility doesn't mean surrender. You can assume control of the property before foreclosure. It'll force her to face what she's done. The suggestion made my stomach twist. That would mean evicting my own daughter. Harriet didn't look away. It would mean stopping her from dragging you down with her. There's a difference. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The kitchen clock ticked softly, marking each passing second like a small verdict. Finally! She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. You've spent a lifetime saving everyone else from the storm. Evelyn, maybe it's time to build your own shelter. The words found a place somewhere deep inside me, steady, terrifying, and true. When I left her house, the sky had darkened with the promise of rain. I drove back over the bridge, the wind carrying the scent of the sea and jasmine. The envelope from the bank lay on the passenger seat beside me, now joined by the contract Harriet had carefully returned. For the first time in years, I didn't feel lost in the current. I felt the faint, unfamiliar pull of direction. The Charleston County Courthouse always had a particular smell, a mix of old wood polish, paper, and the faint tang of rain from the open rotunda windows. The morning of the hearing, that smell filled my lungs like something too familiar to be comforting. Harriet met me at the steps, her briefcase in one hand, a folded umbrella in the other. They filed fast. She said, her tone clipped but calm. Coercion, undue influence, emotional distress. Their lawyer's argument will be thin, but loud. I'm not sure I'm ready for loud, I said. She gave me a small smile. Then let me be. Inside. The courtroom felt colder than it should have. The air conditioning hummed too high, making the walls echo when people whispered. Marissa and Nathan sat at the opposite table. She wore a cream suit that matched the courtroom walls, her hair pinned neatly, every gesture controlled. Nathan kept his head down, flipping nervously through a sheaf of papers he likely didn't understand. When she glanced my way, her expression was unreadable. No anger, no warmth, just distance. The judge entered, a woman with silver hair pulled tight into a bun. Her nameplate read, Onnin, Miriam Lowenstein, and her eyes, clear and sharp, held the weariness of someone who'd heard too many versions of the same family tragedy. Case number 24-317. Rourke v. Rourke, the clerk announced. The sound of my name against hers echoed longer than it should have. Marissa's attorney, a man named Daniel Klein, rose first. He had the kind of polished confidence that comes from representing clients who rarely lose. His voice was smooth, almost sympathetic. Your Honor, this is not a case about money. It's about manipulation. My client, Mrs. Marissa Rourke Gray, was placed under undue pressure by her mother to sign a financial document during a time of emotional and financial vulnerability. We seek to nullify the ownership clause that transferred control of her property. Harriet rose slowly when he finished, her tone even, unhurried. Your Honor, the evidence will show that the document in question was not only reviewed by legal counsel at the time, but was signed voluntarily, with full understanding of its contents. What my client offered was not coercion, it was rescue. The first hour blurred. Bank records, copies of emails, notarized statements, all of it paraded across the table between us like evidence of a crime I hadn't committed. Marissa kept her eyes on the floor, speaking only when prompted. When it was her turn to testify, her lawyer asked softly, "Did you feel pressured when your mother presented the contract?" She hesitated, then said, "She told me I'd lose everything if I didn't sign. I didn't feel like I had a choice." Harriet stood. "Mrs. Gray, did your mother ever raise her voice during that meeting?" "No." "Did she threaten you?" "No." "Did she give you time to review the contract?" Marissa shifted. She said Harriet could explain it to me." Harriet nodded. "And I did. You asked 2 questions about repayment terms and ownership duration. Do you remember my answers?" Marissa's lips parted, then closed again. "Not exactly." "The answers were clear." Harriet continued. "You signed freely, in a public place, with witnesses. And then you took her money, $60,000 to $1,000, to save your business." Daniel Klein objected, but the judge overruled him. As Harriet sat down, she leaned toward me. Let them hang themselves with their own silence. By the time the recess was called, I felt hollow. My coffee had gone cold. Outside the courtroom, I caught sight of Nathan by the vending machines. His tie was crooked when he noticed me. He looked torn between guilt and exhaustion. She thought she could fix it quietly. He said under his breath, "She's terrified." "Evelyn, she should be honest." I said, "She doesn't know how." His voice cracked. "She thinks truth means losing." I didn't reply. When the hearing resumed, Harriet called one final witness, the notary public, from 2016, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. She testified simply. Mrs. Gray signed willingly. There was no hesitation. She even joked that her mom was saving her from herself. That line landed like a quiet bell through the courtroom. The judge took her time reviewing the folders before her. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but certain. The court finds no evidence of coercion. The contract stands as written. Legal ownership remains with Ms. Evelyn Rourke. The gavel struck once. The sound was small but final. Marissa froze, her knuckles white against the table. Nathan reached for her hand, but she pulled away. The attorney leaned in to whisper something. But she didn't move. I gathered my papers slowly. Harriet touched my arm. "It's done," she said softly. "You're free. Free." The word didn't land the way I thought it would. It felt heavier. Not lighter, like something had been removed. But the space it left still ached. Outside, the sky was a washed-out blue. The kind Charleston gets after rain. Harriet offered to take me to lunch, but I declined. I needed air, distance. Something quiet enough to make sense of the noise still echoing in my chest. I walked down Meeting Street toward the parking lot, heels clicking softly on the wet pavement. My reflection followed me in the puddles older. Steadier, lonelier. When I reached the car, I stopped and looked back once through the courthouse glass. Marissa was still inside, arguing with her lawyer. For a moment, I thought she might look up, might see me standing there, but she didn't. I opened the car door, set the envelope with the court's ruling on the seat beside me, and sat in silence. The victory felt real, but it wasn't sweet. It was something colder truth uncovered after too many years of quiet denial. And in that truth, there was both peace and loss. Twined so tightly I couldn't tell them apart. The court's ruling reached them faster than I expected. 3 days after the hearing, a courier in a navy jacket delivered the envelope to their doorstep on Rutledge Avenue. I didn't need to be there to imagine the scene, Marissa standing at the window, arms folded, watching him walk up the drive with the kind of indifference only certainty can give. She'd believed it was impossible for anything truly final to happen to her. By evening, the call came not from her, but from Nathan. His voice was low, cautious. She got the notice. He said, "She's not taking it well." I waited for him to continue, but he didn't. I could hear the faint rustle of papers, the sound of her voice in the background, angry, disbelieving. "She says you're humiliating her," he added, "that you're turning this into revenge." "It isn't revenge," I said. "It's consequence." Nathan sighed. "I know, but you know her pride." "I do." I said, "It's what's killing her." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing her face when she read the notice, the black seal at the top. The words, termination of occupancy, her name printed below mine in small, official letters. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was grief in a quieter shape. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the air washed clean. Helen came by with fresh bread, her hair tied back under a red scarf. She took one look at me and said, "You did what had to be done." I nodded. "I just wish it hadn't come to this. Things like this," she said, slicing the loaf carefully. "Always come to this when you spend years pretending peace is the same as silence." I sat across from her, the smell of warm bread filling the kitchen. "She'll have 30 days, I said. "Enough time to find her footing." Helen handed me a slice, and maybe enough time to find herself. When she left, the house grew quiet again. I walked to the window, watching sunlight break through the clouds, and wondered if accountability was just another word for love finally telling the truth. It was almost dusk when I heard the knock, a hesitant, uneven rhythm that didn't belong to strangers. I knew before opening the door that it was her. Marissa stood on the porch, her makeup streaked, hair damp with the humidity that clung to Charleston evenings. The same daughter who had once stood before me in triumph now looked small, almost breakable. "Mom," she whispered. "Please, can I come in?" I stepped aside. She walked in slowly, as if unsure she was still allowed. The scent of her perfume lingered faintly behind her, a ghost of the woman who used to command every room she entered. For a long time, she didn't speak. She stood in the middle of my living room, staring at the framed photos on the mantel, her graduation, Dylan's first birthday, one of her and Paul at the lake when she was 5. Her shoulders trembled. "I got the papers," she said finally, her voice thin and breaking. "Nathan says it's just procedure, but it feels like you've given up on me." I folded my hands in front of me. "It's not about giving up. It's about letting go." She turned to face me, tears spilling freely now. "I made mistakes. I know that. I pushed too hard. I said things I shouldn't have. But this will destroy us. Dylan's school, the business, it's all tied to that house. If we lose it," her breath hitched. "Please, Mom, don't do this. I'll change. I swear I'll change." Her words were familiar echoes of every promise she'd made when things began to fall apart. But this time, something was different. There was no edge of pride, no practiced tone of persuasion, just fear. I walked to the window, needing a moment to steady myself. Outside, the sky was streaked with orange and rose, the marsh grasses rippling gently in the wind. I remembered all the nights I'd prayed for her to find her own footing, to stand without my hand holding her up. When I turned back, she was on her knees. "I don't care about the money. Just please don't take away my home." I knelt beside her, my hand resting on her shoulder. "Marissa," I said softly, "that house was never meant to be your prison, or mine. It's time to stop pretending it's what keeps us together." She shook her head, sobbing harder. Then what will the truth, I said, and what we choose to build after it? For a moment, she buried her face in my lap the way she used to as a child, when thunder frightened her. I stroked her hair, feeling the tremor in her body, the weight of years pressing between us. I didn't tell her I'd already called Harriet to delay the process by a few weeks. Some truths don't need to be spoken immediately. Mercy, I was learning, didn't always mean reversal. It meant giving someone space to face what they'd become without losing who they once were. The next morning broke gray and cool, the kind of Charleston morning that made everything seem quieter than it really was. I brewed 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, though I wasn't sure why. By the time Marissa came downstairs, her eyes were swollen but calmer, her voice small. I didn't sleep, she murmured, sitting at the table. Neither did I said. I slid a cup toward her. She wrapped her hands around it, as if trying to draw warmth back into herself. The silence between us was heavy but not hostile. It was the kind of quiet that comes when there's nothing left to hide behind. I called Harriet last night, I said. I asked her to hold the eviction order for 1 week. After that, I can't stop it. Her head lifted, eyes wide with disbelief. You're still going through with it. I'm not taking your house to punish you, I said. I'm asking you to move out so you can start again without pretending everything's fine. You've been living in a house built on fear, on debt, and on me. It's time to build something that's yours. Her chin trembled. But we have nowhere to go. You will, I said. I reached into my purse and placed an envelope on the table between us. Her name was written across the front in my handwriting. For a new start. She stared at it for a long time before touching it. What is this enough for first and last month's rent somewhere small, somewhere quiet? I spoke to a woman in Somerville who's renting out a cottage behind her bakery. It isn't grand, but it's safe. Dylan can stay with me until you settle. Tears welled again, softer this time. You're still helping me, she whispered. I'm helping you leave the way I should have helped you live by letting you stand. Marissa pressed the envelope against her chest as if afraid it might vanish. I don't deserve this, she said. Maybe not, I said gently, but grace doesn't wait for deserving. For a long while, neither of us moved. The light shifted through the kitchen window, falling across the table, across the papers, across the lines between us. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small silver key, the one to the house on Rutledge Avenue. She placed it beside her coffee cup. I guess these were always your. I picked up the key, turning it between my fingers. They were ours, I said, but some things are meant to be passed on, not held. She nodded slowly, standing to leave. At the door, she hesitated. Thank you, she said. It wasn't loud, but it was the first time I'd heard her say it without expectation. After she left, I stood in the doorway for a long time, holding the key and watching the street empty under the gray morning light. It felt like both an ending and a return, the sound of a door closing without the echo of guilt behind it. A month later, the air smelled of pine and rain. The cabin by Lake Keowee was smaller than I remembered from the listing, but the quiet around it felt enormous. In the mornings, mist curled low over the water, soft as breath. At night, the crickets sang like they'd waited years for someone to listen. The realtor had left a small brass key on the porch rail, tied with a white ribbon. I'd kept it there even after moving in. It reminded me of the day Marissa placed her house key on my kitchen table, an exchange I hadn't planned, but somehow had been preparing for all my life. Inside, the boxes were mostly unpacked. The bookshelf from my old cottage stood near the window, filled with photographs and paperbacks. On the mantel, a single frame, Marissa and Dylan, both smiling, taken long before the weight of money and pride had crept between us. Every few days, she called. The conversations were tentative but real updates about Dylan's new school, the bakery cottage in Somerville, how she was learning to make rent on her own. Once, She said, "I think I understand what you meant." I didn't ask which part. Some truths don't need repetition, they just need time to settle. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the last of the sunlight slide across the lake. The new light fixture above the door glowed softly, casting a warm halo over the steps. I turned it on, the switch clicking under my thumb. "This light isn't for waiting anymore," I whispered into the dusk. "It's for peace." The reflection shimmered on the water, steady and whole, no longer a beacon for what I'd lost, but for everything I'd finally reclaimed.